Okay, we are ready to get underway with tonight's presentation. This is going to be a brand new presentation, and tonight we're going to be talking about success stories. And we're going to focus on two North American animals that most people love, eagles and otters. And what we have today for presenters, I do have a special guest joining me today because oftentimes I do many of these on my own, but today I'm bringing in Robert Brewer. And I'm going to let Robert introduce himself in just a minute. But for tonight's presentation on eagles and otters, it'll be myself, Daryl Radijak, and Robert Brewer. And just like we do with every other presentation, I think it's really important that you know and understand who your instructors are so you have faith in the information that you're getting. Most people know me. Again, my name's Daryl Radijak. I have my degree in wildlife management from the State University of New York College of Environmental Science and Forestry. That's part of Syracuse University. But many of you know I started my career at the Appalachian Bear Center as one of their first curators. Did that for about 5 years. And then, excuse me, I graduated up and took a position with the Tennessee Wildlife Resources Agency. And because of that bear experience, I was soon promoted to the big game coordinator. So that means I was managing all the black bears, all the deer, all the elk, and all the wild hogs in the state of Tennessee. I did that for about 7 years or 9 years. I don't know. It was a bunch of years. And then the director saw something in me and he promoted me to the chief of wildlife for the agency. And so for about 5 years, I was over all of wildlife for the state of Tennessee. Awesome, awesome job. But as a little boy, I always wanted to see what it'd be like living and working out west. And so about 4 years ago, I moved out west and I'm currently in northern New Mexico, which is a diamond in the rough. Absolutely gorgeous place, lots of animals, lots of amazing landscapes. But for the most part, I have my whole career invested to working with wildlife. So I've got over 25 years of not just learning about wildlife, but hands-on experience dealing with issues that are facing a lot of these species we're going to talk about today. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Robert. Make sure you unmute your microphone, and if you could tell people a little bit about your background.
Okay, I was born, raised, and still live in Knoxville, Tennessee. Never got far from home. Attended the University of Tennessee for bachelor's in wildlife and fishery science. Left, went off to Kentucky at Eastern Kentucky University for a couple of years, and came back to UT. Finished up a master's in ecology and evolutionary biology. Again with wildlife. I'm now associate professor and coordinator of the Greg A. Vital Center for Natural Resources and Conservation at Cleveland State Community College, and I have been there for almost 17 years now. And I'm an active member and officer in the Tennessee State chapter of the Wildlife Society.
Deal.
And
all right, good deal.
And I have personal experience working with otters.
Oh, you're going to tell us about the.
You're going to tell us about them.
Yes.
Okay,
I'll go back to mute.
So, what we're going to do to get started here is, before we jump into talking about these two awesome species, I love giving the public a little bit of background information about what it means, what it means when we're talking about conservation and what Robert and I have been doing for the better part of our career. So you all know this gentleman. I've brought him up probably a dozen times throughout my talks. A gentleman by the name of Aldo Leopold. And he is the father of what we call wildlife conservation. And one of the ways that he defines conservation is a state of harmony between man and the land. And if you don't know anything about Aldo, besides him being the father of wildlife conservation, he is the most amazing writer I've ever read. It's literally true poetry, and I recommend every single book. Start with the Sand County Almanac and read from there. The man was a true genius and a true poet. But when it comes to conservation, he said a couple of things that were really impactful. Conservation is our effort to preserve the capacity of the land for self-renewal. And so if you break that apart, literally what that means is if we do our part to restore habitats and to really make sure that the land is in the best condition possible, the wildlife will take care of itself. It will renew itself. So besides the vegetation renewing itself, the wildlife will respond to that renewed vegetation. And so one of the big parts of conservation is making sure the habitats are intact for all wildlife. But the one thing that I want to make sure everyone understands, conservation is not preservation. Preservation is this concept of hands off. You buy something, or a chunk of land, and then you set it aside and you don't touch it. It's that hands off mentality. And that's not really what we're talking about with conservation. Conservation involves active management. If we know there are good things to do for the land or for the wildlife itself, it's our responsibility to do that. And so he talks about in many of his books this thing called a land ethic, but it's more or less doing whatever you can to ensure that the natural resources and the wildlife resources are well taken care of. But one of the greatest quotes he has, and in fact, Robert, I'll prepare you now. I'm going to ask you if you have a great quote from Aldo Leopold. But one of my favorite ones is, he said in one of his writings, to keep every cog and wheel is the first sign of intelligent tinkering. And so if you have a system, and in this case we're dealing with wildlife systems, with ecosystems, that first sign of intelligence is to make sure you keep every part. So literally every piece of that ecosystem is important. And what we have found out over time is we're really good at losing stuff. We'll lose species, we'll lose the certain types of vegetation. And it's really, really important to keep, like Aldo said, to keep every cog and wheel in that system to make sure it's functioning all right. So, Robert, just curious, do you have any particular Aldo quote? Because I know you talk about him quite often. Make sure you unmute.
There we go. It's the "like winds and sunsets" quote, where he said, "Like winds and sunsets, wild things were taken for granted until progress began to do away with them. Now we face the question whether a still higher standard of living is worth its cost in things natural, wild, and free. And for us, the minority, the opportunity to see geese is more important than television." And I think that carries even more weight today than it did when he wrote it back in 1930 something.
It's absolutely crazy to read what Aldo wrote, knowing that when he lived in the early 1900s, the world was vastly different. And believe it or not, it wasn't different in a good way. Things were in really, really bad shape when Aldo was doing a lot of his work and a lot of his writing, and he saw the need for this conservation. So with that, I'm going to jump in. And what I plan to do is do most of the talking, especially for the eagle part, but I'll ask Robert to chime in as color commentator because he has some stories that are phenomenal when it comes to otters. So let's first off start with just talking about animals in North America. And one of the things I'm a biologist, I'm a scientist, and so I always got to try to work in a graph some way or another, but I try to make them as simple and as self-explanatory as possible. And so that little graphic there, you see all sorts of these crazy, amazing, awesome, different species that inhabited North America when Europeans first discovered it and first started settling. Now keep in mind, humans were in North America for tens of thousands of years, but it wasn't until the European settlers that things really, really started to change. And one of the things that started to change, and not in a good way, is the fact that we like to exploit things, or Europeans like to exploit things, and sometimes they overexploit things. And so what you see with a lot of wildlife populations is they tend to decline. If you watch them, their populations begin to lower and lower and lower. And this red line that I just put up is an example of what happens when a species goes extinct. We start seeing decreases in their population, and over time, before you know it, there is zero population. Now, fortunately, North America still has most of those original bird and mammal species, but we have lost a few. And so, for example, you all know the story of the passenger pigeon, the Carolina parakeet, ivory-billed woodpecker. If you want to get into the subspecies talk, there's the eastern cougar, there's the eastern elk. There's a lot of species that we wiped out completely from the face of the earth. Some of those were subspecies. But oftentimes what happens is when man comes in, begins to alter the habitat, begins to change things, you start to see population declines. Some of them are rather gradual over time. There may be some other populations that do just fine, and then something changes in a quick instant, and all of a sudden the population begins to crash. And so we can follow literally what populations are doing and whether or not we need to send up red flags to say, hey, this population is in trouble. Now, the good news is there's some populations that we'll be looking at and we'll notice this decline. But here's the thing, folks, and I want you to understand that, is based on Aldo Leopold and so many other of these pioneer conservationists, we have realized that we, besides negatively impacting wildlife, we can positively impact them. So when humans put their minds together and figure out how to fix something, sometimes we can turn those populations around and bring them back, sometimes even stronger than when we first noticed their decline. And so what we want to do today is talk about two of the species that we will call North American success stories. And so the two that we're going to talk about tonight are the bald eagle, and thanks to Dana Parrish for bringing up river otters. We thought that would be another good one. So we're going to talk about one bird species and one mammal species, and some of the success stories we're talking about here in North America. So before I go on, Robert, do you want to add anything regarding conservation or Leopold or anything like that before I jump into?
I'll just add real quick that, and Daryl, you need to get the new book from the Wildlife Society on the North American model. Really interesting introduction in there, and it goes back to even before Europeans. And it talks about before our actual physical presence on the landscape causing declines in populations. The populations weren't necessarily as high as they thought they were because Native Americans had an impact, but then introduction of disease and things like that had knocked the Native American populations back, and some of these the animal populations really exploded, and then we came in and exploited them again. So there's really been this seesaw, this up and down on our native North American populations for tens of thousands of years because of man's activities.
That is such a great point. One of the things that I thought was so interesting, where I'm at in New Mexico, we have a number of these Indian pueblos, and if you think of the cliff dwellers that you learned about in school, those were all here in the Southwest. And one of those pueblos, the Jemez Pueblo, where we take a lot of those Tennessee students, there was an estimate when that Jemez Pueblo thousands and thousands of years ago was in its heyday. There was more people living in that Jemez Pueblo than in the city of London, England. And so people think North America was void of people, and it was not. It was a booming, civilized country, and well, maybe not a country, but booming civilization here in North America. And they used wildlife, they lived with wildlife, but it wasn't until the Europeans came over that things started drastically changing when it comes to habitat. Okay, so I'm going to jump into the bald eagle. I get the fun one. Well, they're both fun actually. But the way I'm going to start this one is we're going to get nerdy, sciencey on you and tell you the scientific name of the bald eagle. And it's Haliaeetus leucocephalus. Now, I don't know if anyone out there has taken Latin, but Latin is one of those nerdy dead languages that I took a long, long time ago, but I still retain a little bit of it, which helps us out, or helps me out tremendously when it comes to wildlife. So looking at the scientific name, that Haliaeetus leucocephalus, the first part of that, Haliaeetus, it's a combination of two Latin words. Halo, which represents the ocean or the sea, and then eatus is the Latin term for eagle. So literally, Haliaeetus means sea eagle. And then the second part of that, leucocephalus, this one's a little bit easier because many of you have probably heard of leukocytes or white blood cells, or you might have heard or seen a leucistic animal, which is an animal that has a white coloration, or it's oddly colored white, that's leucistic or leucism. So that means white. And then cephalus means of the head. So literally, leucocephalus means sea eagle with a white head. And so if you didn't take Latin, you'd never know that. You just think it's just some crazy word to confuse people, but it actually makes a lot of sense, some of these scientific terms for some of these animals. Now, does every eagle have a white head, or every bald eagle have a white head? What kind of eagle do you think that is? And I'll let you type it in. Anyone know what kind of eagle that is? I'll wait until a couple of you are done typing. I will tell you that okay, y'all are too smart. I was hoping some of you would say that's a golden eagle, and it's not. It is actually a bald eagle that is just immature, and the white head did not come in yet. One of the telltale signs, obviously, you see it fishing. Bald eagles tend to be more piscivorous, and that's another geeky, fancy term meaning it eats fish. Pisces, if you think of the horoscope, is the fish. And so eagles, bald eagles, are piscivorous. Golden eagles, which are shown here, are more forest birds. You find those over land quite a bit. In fact, they spend almost their entire life over land or forested areas, where bald eagles are usually found along waterways. And just so you know, Robert, if ever you want to chime in with any anecdote or anything, just unmute and then I'll let you turn over. So don't wait until I call on you. But here's a good snapshot. I will tell you, Bob Howdeshell, who I get most of these pictures from, is absolutely phenomenal. But this is a great picture. These two birds are identical as far as what species of bird they are. The bird on the left is an immature bald, and the bird on the right is the mature bald eagle. And correct me if I'm wrong, Robert, but I believe they do not develop that white head until about 4 or 5 years of age.
It's several years of age. Might want to point out, how do you know that's not a golden eagle?
Audience.
Does anybody know how you know that?
I'll let audience
is not a golden eagle? What about those? Shirley's got it with the feet, but what about the feet? That's right, Shirley. Golden eagles look like they're wearing a pair of feather pants all the way down to the ankles. Bald eagles have bald ankles.
Okay. Yeah, thanks for bringing that up. And that's one thing I will tell you when it comes to my birding. There are some birders out there that are phenomenal. In fact, Bob Howdeshell is a fantastic birder. Robert's good in his own right, and so we probably should have switched. I should have did otters and you do eagles, but that's great to point that out, Robert. Okay, now what I have up here is the range map for bald eagles. And typically, anyone that has sat through some of my presentations before, when we're talking about bears or cougars or anything like that, a lot of times I will show the historic range map, and then once European settlers came, I'll show you how their range has shrunken considerably. Now, I'm not showing that for the eagles because, for example, in bird situations, birds fly away. And so you're not going to see their range decrease considerably because they still stay in the same areas. They just find those pockets. What you'll find over time is their numbers will decrease, but the range will pretty much stay the same. Now, when you're looking at this map, you see it's breeding or non-breeding or year-round. And I don't know if you're watching this on a computer or a larger screen, but you can see the year-round locations are a lot of those major waterways. So shooting up the Mississippi River, the Tennessee River, some of those major waterways is where you'll have eagles living year-round. Now, the difference between this breeding and non-breeding map, pretty easy to think about. The breeding time is pretty much the summertime. Non-breeding time is the wintertime. So birds migrate back and forth. And so in the summer, the eagles can go far north because all the snow and ice has melted away. There's lots of water exposed. And these birds are mostly feeding in these waterways. Their main diet, like I said, is fish. And so in the summertime, they can go extremely far north. In the wintertime, that non-breeding time, they've got to head back down to the south so they can get open water to continue feeding. Now, one of the interesting things about bald eagles, they're the only eagle that is unique to North America. Now, we do have two species of eagles in North America, the bald eagle and the golden eagle, but the golden eagle is also found throughout Eurasia and in the Eastern Hemisphere. So it's all throughout the Northern Hemisphere. And so the bald eagle is the only one that's really indigenous only to North America. Now, what happened with them? I told you their range didn't decrease much, but we started seeing tremendous population declines with the bald eagle. Everyone knows that's our national symbol. And we became quite concerned when we started seeing these populations decline tremendously. So what do you think caused that? I'll give you a couple of them, and then I want you to guess. So a lot of people may think that overexploitation through hunting or shooting of the eagles caused decline. That was not so much the case. Yes, eagles were used not so much for meat products, but for ceremonial feathers or for design of women's hat. And so there was some exploitation that took place. But for the most part, it wasn't the hunting or the shooting. One of the big things that started happening with eagles that caused population decline was habitat loss. And so if you're an eagle and you love living by the water, feeding on the fish, just making a good old time of your habitat, this is a great example of what good habitat looks like. But what besides eagles like to live by the water? Well, you guessed it, people do. And so some of these major waterways from the Mississippi River, all these major tributaries of the Mississippi, the Tennessee River, Cumberland River, they're big waterways, and that's where people gravitated to. We use that as a transportation system, and obviously we built towns and we built areas all around the river systems. And so these were tremendous resources and habitat for the eagle, and when we took that away from them, you had a tremendous amount of habitat loss. And so the eagles kind of suffered from that habitat loss. But who here, I was just going to ask, who here can name the number one thing that caused eagle decline? And a couple of you have already typed it. Now I'm going to first start out to say it was more or less agriculture. That was the main reason for it. But what in particular really hurt the eagles was this use of DDT. Now I see everyone has typed in DDT. I'll give you an extra bonus class. I tell you what, I'll give you a free webinar if someone can tell me what does DDT stand for and spell it correctly. And if nobody types, Robert, you could probably do this. Surely that doesn't count. I'll give you 10 more seconds. All right, I don't think anyone's going to get it. DDT stands for dichloro-diphenyl trichloroethane. Piece of cake. And that's the thing that really, really hurt the eagles. Now, I will tell you, this DDT, it was first developed in the 1800s. 1874 was the first time it was synthesized in a lab. To be truthful, and I'm not going to pretend to be an expert on this, I don't even know the original reason why it was synthesized. But it was traced back to 1874, the first time they ever developed it. And so one of the things that they found out, and it wasn't until probably 50 or 60 years later, is that this DDT was a fantastic insecticide. So you apply it um, to an insect, and it will kill the insect. It has tremendous impact on endocrine systems and some of the biological functions of not just insects, but mammals as well. And so when you apply this to a living animal, it does a really good job of killing it. What was really cool about DDT, and they thought this was the savior, was it didn't readily get absorbed by the plants. And so you could spray it on the plant, and the plant would not take it up. It would literally just kill the insects that were living on that plant. But here's the thing. We started using it widespread use throughout the mid-1900s. And so it was the number one insecticide that farmers were using to spray all their crops. And so it was gangbusters using DDT all throughout the country in these agricultural fields. And like I said, they were using it to try to, it was used as a pesticide to reduce the number of insect damage to the crops. The problem is DDT doesn't just magically disappear. It would remain on the plants or drop down into the soil. And when it would rain, it would wash away. And so every field, when it rains, it will drain eventually. And if you know anything about water, it all flows downhill and eventually ends up in a river system. And so all this DDT, this highly toxic stuff for insects and mammals alike, would end up in our waterways. And so you have a system like this, beautiful, beautiful system. And what do you see here? You see a picture of a beautiful trout, but you also see what's in the background. You have these waterfowl swimming. And so all these animals that live their entire life in this now polluted water, polluted with DDT water, they're going to begin to pick up that chemical. And the body will try to process it, and what it does, it will store, if it could filter out that chemical, it will store it in the fat cells. And so these animals living in this contaminated water became highly contaminated with this DDT. And what comes along that loves to eat fish and waterfowl? It's our good old bald eagle. And so what you find is whenever you have some type of environmental toxin, it tends to build up most in the apex predators, the top of that food chain. And so these birds were feeding exclusively on these contaminated fish. So the bald eagles themselves were becoming impacted by these high levels of DDT. And so everyone knows bald eagles are really, really good at catching fish. But in case you don't know, they're really good at catching waterfowl too. And so I've observed upwards of almost 20 bald eagles sitting in a single oak tree along the Mississippi River, overlooking a pond full of ducks, waiting for that first duck to make a move because those eagles would pounce on it. And so these eagles, just doing what they do, were feeding on some heavily, heavily contaminated animals. And so, like I said, DDT was beginning to have an effect on the eagles. And I know some of you have mentioned it already, but what are the effects of DDT? Does it just simply kill the eagle? Well, no, not really. It takes quite a bit of toxin to outright kill the bald eagle. But what happens is when they're feeding on these fish, they're picking up more and more DDT. That chemical begins to affect the endocrine system. And what it results in, oftentimes, especially with birds, is the endocrine system really helps in egg development. And because of the DDT poisoning, the eagle would lay eggs that would have very, very weak and thin shells. And so literally, the eagle would survive fine. It would lay an egg, but the egg, instead of having a hard shell, it would almost be leathery. And it was so weak that these eggs oftentimes couldn't even stand up to the weight of their own mother incubating them. And so these birds were going through the process, mating, laying eggs, but those eggs simply weren't surviving. And so we started seeing this tremendous precipitous fall in the number of bald eagles. And so remember, DDT use started 1939. 20 some years go by, almost 25 years go by. And in that 2-decade long time period, we saw that their numbers dropped to below 500 pairs in the entire lower 48. I think it was estimated 477. And so we knew something was going crazy wrong with the eagles. And it didn't take long for researchers to see what was happening with their eggs, test the eggs, and find out it was related to the use of DDT. And so what did we do about it? Well, I'm going to give you a timeline. This is where the power of human thinking can really come into play, and shows you that we do know what we're doing when we put our brains together. And so this first date, I'm throwing out there because it's really important, but this is before we started really seeing declines in bald and golden eagles. But in 1940, we passed the Bald and Golden Eagle Protection Act. That pretty much protected the nesting areas of a lot of these birds when we did know where they were. But that preceded the precipitous fall of the eagles. But this is where it gets interesting. And this shows that people were really starting to think about this. 1966, Endangered Species Preservation Act. It wasn't the law that we're all well aware of, but this was the first time that Congress and the rest of the country started thinking about this. And in 1966, that Preservation Act mostly focused on setting aside land to protect some of these species that were imperiled. 1969, we included an amendment there that says, hey, maybe we ought to start thinking of individual species as well. It still wasn't the full-blown act. But this is where things really started to gain momentum. 1972, eagles gained protection on the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. We know that these animals don't know boundaries. And so we made this Migratory Bird Treaty Act, where it deals with the United States, Canada, Mexico, knowing that we all share the same resource and we all have to work together to protect that resource. But this is the big one. 1972, we banned almost all use of DDT. And so this is where things really started to change around. We identified that as being the big issue with eagles. And so we banned its use in for agricultural uses. 1973, that Endangered Species Act was finally signed into law. It's the ESA that we all know and love today. In 1973, bald eagles were listed in that, and they were listed as an endangered species. We were afraid they were going to go extinct. All throughout the 1980s, we developed these bald eagle recovery plans. There was one for the Southeast, the Midwest, the Chesapeake Bay area. We had all these really detailed plans that told us what we need to do in order to restore bald eagles. And so we were really getting on the ball, giving all these protections to this wonderful bird. And so the yellow marks the turnaround. We started seeing some really, really good things happening. Bald eagle numbers were coming back. And so 1995, we changed them from being endangered to just threatened. And so literally it's just one level up from endangered. 1999, we proposed to delist them because the numbers were coming back so much. And then in 2000, the final rule to delist, to take bald eagles off the endangered species list.
No, the only thing I would say is while DDT is definitely banned in the United States, it is still being manufactured, and it's being used in some other countries, especially countries with high rates of malaria. Because one treatment can protect people for 6 months at a time, they use it a little more judiciously than we did. But it is still being made. It is still being used worldwide. It's just banned in the United States.
All that regulation. And the cool thing with that is banning in the United States has had tremendous positive impacts in the United States. But I wanted to show you an example of how effective all this legislation was. And so we're going to talk about the Chesapeake Bay, which is along the Atlantic coast, the eastern coast of the United States. Here's an example of what was happening in the Chesapeake Bay. So let's start with 1930s. There was about anywhere from 600 to 800 breeding pairs of bald eagles on the Chesapeake Bay, which seemed like a pretty good number. 1940s, this is, like I said, 1939 was the kind of the initial discovery, and then throughout the 40s and 50s, we were going gangbusters on using DDT for commercial use, agricultural use. We peaked 1959. 80 million pounds were applied nationwide of this highly toxic chemical. And so by the 1970s, again, this is where we know something's going major wrong with eagles and probably a whole slew of other species. But we noticed there was only 60 breeding pairs of golden eagles found in Chesapeake Bay. This is down from 600 to 800, so only about 1/10 of the number of birds. And like I said, we knew something was major wrong there. So 1972, we banned the use of DDT. So you can't use it anymore. And within a short period of time, we started seeing some recovery. So by 2001, 30 years after that, we're back up to 646 breeding pairs of bald eagles. So within a few decades, we're back to where we first started tracking eagles, which was 600 to 800 pairs. And so we recovered to that point. But this is where it gets so cool. We didn't realize, because obviously 1930s, things weren't great for the eagles to begin with. But just a couple of years ago, there was close to 2,000 breeding pairs of bald eagles in Chesapeake Bay. So that's even almost 3 times more than what we ever first started documenting anyway. And so it goes to show, once we put our mind to something, we can really do good things for individual species when we think of this.
Can I chime in on one thing there too, Daryl? And that's indicative of something else that was going on as well, and something we don't often think about. When you think of bald eagles, you think of DDT, banned DDT, they came back. But at the same time all this was happening, we also had things like the Clean Water Act. We also had wetlands restoration. Just cleaning up the waterways had a huge impact. DDT was not the only endocrine disrupting chemical in our ecosystem. We had mercury problems, we had PCB problems causing all those. All those were pretty much addressed simultaneously. So yes, DDT was a terrible problem, but it wasn't the only problem that was fixed at that time. Yeah. Yes, Dana, I can't answer your question. Yes, it is possible to have too many. There are some places where bald eagles are actually nuisance species, especially around aquaculture facilities, fisheries operations. While it is a national symbol, it's great, and I love bald eagles, they are as much scavenger as they are active predator. So anywhere there's a food source, they will build up in there and become a nuisance animal. So yes, it is possible to have too many bald eagles.
Okay, I'm going to finish this out. And Robert, it is amazing how you when we get to the otter part, you'll see how right in line your thoughts were. So let me finish this eagle stuff, but I just want to show you. So that was Chesapeake Bay. Now most states will have a biologist that tracks their eagles, and so I'm going to just show you. This is from Oklahoma. Don't read the graph, just look at the trends on the number of breeding pairs that are detected. So there's Oklahoma. Here's the number of breeding pairs in Minnesota, in Florida, in California. Everything's going up and up. Here it is in Idaho. Here it is in Ohio. Tremendously positive trends in breeding pairs. The state of Washington, and last but not least, in the state of Maryland. So literally every state you're looking at that we started doing these good things for the environment, for the habitat, you're seeing these trends. And so throughout the entire 48 states, the lower 48 states, we have tremendous increases in bald eagle breeding pairs. And so that's why we were able to delist them in 2007. So with that, I'm going to end the eagle talk. And does anyone have an eagle question before we get onto the river otter? Molly, what is the predator of bald eagles besides humans? It's pretty simple. There's really not much. Obviously, when you have an eagle on a nest, if it's a young eagle, there are some things that can take it. You have nest predators that can destroy a young eagle nest. But once that bald eagle matures, it is literally considered an apex predator. So there's not many other things that will kill that bald eagle to feed on it. And so humans are pretty much the only impact when it comes to killing bald eagles. And for the most part, it's not that we're killing individuals, but we're impacting the habitat so much that the individuals end up dying. Okay, we're going to jump into the otter thing. I'm going to do a couple of slides, but then I'm going to turn it over to Robert. Oh, I'm sorry, this is my ending eagle part. I do got to say, Bob Houdeshell is such an amazing photographer. I love that photo on the left. That's an immature bald. But Bob Houdeshell has fantastic photos that he lets me use, and I got to give him credit when credit is due. But for the most part, bald eagle, true American success story. And so with that, and then there were otters. And what we're going to do, we're going to talk a little bit about river otters to be exact, because there's also sea otters, but for the most part, our discussion tonight will be about river otters. Now, the river otter, I wish I had a really cool thing about its Latin name, but I don't really know what Lantra stands for. Canadensis is pretty easy. But that is its scientific name, Lantra canadensis. I will tell you that it is part of the Mustelidae family. Now, does anyone know what this Mustelidae family includes? Yep, it includes all those. It's more or less what we would consider the weasel family. Now, one of the biggest, I was looking up to see which was the biggest of the weasel family, and it's kind of a debate. It varies between the wolverine and the sea otter can get pretty darn big too. So from a pure land mammal standpoint, it's probably the wolverine. Badgers are also pretty big, but the sea otter is one of the largest in this Mustelidae family. River otters are a little bit smaller than their seaworthy cousins. So let me talk a little bit about biology. Not going to spend too much of a time on this, but they are active year-round. They're not like bears we talk about all the time going into hibernation or this torpor and kind of decrease in their activity in the wintertime. Otters don't do that. They're active year-round, so they're feeding year-round, and so you're likely to see them all throughout the year. In fact, that might be one of the things you see often is Yellowstone. They'll show the otters doing those slides down to the river. They are highly aquatic. Now, they're not an aquatic species. An aquatic species spends all of its time in the water. A river otter spends a lot of time in the water, but it also spends a lot of time out of the water. But they love water. They're in water quite a bit. In fact, they're they're very efficient predators, and the biggest part of their diet is going to be fish. They love eating fish. So they are totally at home in the water. Excellent swimmers. But because of that ability to go in the water and out, and throughout the winter, they have a really luxurious fur. And obviously, the more waterproof, the higher the quote-unquote thread count or fur count is, the more valuable that fur is. And so it keeps them not just waterproof, but it also keeps them very, very warm. And so if you look at the historic range of otters, they literally covered most of North America. Now you do see a couple of little gaps in that southwestern portion, and that's probably simply because there's not as much water in that part of North America as the rest. And because otters love water so much, you're not going to have really strong populations in those more arid regions. Now, what caused otter decline? Because the reason we're talking about them is there was a point in time when they declined tremendously in their numbers. In fact, their range shrank by almost 75%. So what was the cause of that? Well, in this case, opposite of the eagles, there was quite a bit of trapping and hunting. It was a staple in when the earliest settlers, the European settlers, especially Canada, and in more northern climates, they relied a ton on fur. And like I said, otters have this rich, luxuriant fur that was quite expensive. So there was quite a bit of trapping that took place for these otter pelts historically. Once again, and if you recognize that picture, it's because I use the exact same picture with the eagles. Because otters love to eat fish, that's their primary diet, they live in these riparian areas, these areas that are close to water, so stream systems around lakes. And besides living in those, the otters living in these really pristine riverine areas, people like that too. So otters suffered pretty much the same amount of habitat loss that the eagles did because people like living around water too. But here's one of the big things, and Robert mentioned it, and it has a lot to do with water quality issues. Now, I put this picture up. I'm going to tell a couple stories and show another slide, and then I'm going to turn it over to Robert. But Robert mentioned the quality of water being really, really bad in the mid 1900s, all throughout the 1970s. And I remember as a young boy going up to, we were camping in the Adirondacks. Adirondacks is this beautiful part of northern New York State. Huge, completely natural area filled with lakes. And the thing that was crazy as a little boy, I remember paddling around in these lakes, and it was very much like this picture. It was crystal, crystal clear. And I remember asking my dad about going fishing in there, and my dad apologized. He's like, son, there's no fish in there. And it was so beautiful, so clear. And as a little boy, I didn't realize it, but it was so clear because there was no life in there. That was mostly due to the acid rain, with a lot of the pollution being released back in the 50, 60 years ago. It would literally result in this acid rain, and it would make the pH in these lakes so distorted that life couldn't survive. And so you didn't have insect life that could support the fish, that could then support all those other mammals such as otters. And so things may look beautiful and pristine, but unless you've got clear, healthy waters, things could be really, really bad. And so what changed? What happened that these otters started coming back? And Robert, like I said, you were so fortuitous. He mentioned the Clean Water Act. And just so you know, Robert has never seen this presentation before. 1972, we passed the Clean Water Act. We started requiring industry to lessen the amount of pollutants that they could put into the water systems. I wish we could say they don't put any in there, but there's certain regulations and thresholds that said you cannot over pollute these waterways because things are dying. Another big thing that happened throughout the 70s and 80s is state protections. We knew otter populations were really plummeting. They're in bad shape. And so obviously if people were still trying to trap them for their furs, that was going to make things even worse. So there's a lot of state protections put on these animals. But this is where it gets really cool. We started doing state restoration efforts. And so over about 3 or 4 decades, state wildlife agencies released over 4,000 otters nationwide in all different locations. First started in Colorado. 1976 is when the first otter reintroduction program started. Didn't end until literally less than 10 years ago here in the state of New Mexico. But it was pretty amazing. When you look at the otter restoration that took place, this is where a lot of these otters were released. And so you ask yourself, where did these otters come from? And if you look at this map, there's one thing that stood out right away. In one place really was the ground zero for otter restoration, and it's that southern Louisiana. And there was a person, and this is where I'm going to turn it over to Robert Brewer, because Robert was actually on the ground doing some of this otter restoration. So Robert, why don't you take over and talk for a little bit while I grab something?
Okay, that sounds good. Yeah, if you look at that map, it actually has arrows pointing with numbers of otters sent to different places. And you look there in Tennessee, 487, Kentucky, 355, all these coming from one specific spot in Louisiana in a town called Houma, Houma. And the person he had a picture of up there was Leroy Sevan. It's spelled Sevin, but his name was Sevan. And he was the epitome of a Cajun. When I first met the man, pulled into his driveway and he was talking to his neighbor, and I could catch about every third word. The rest of it was Cajun. I didn't understand what he was saying. He walked up to the window and said, "How y'all did?" And I knew I was in Cajun country then. But Leroy Sevan had the system. He was in southern Louisiana. Otters were actually a nuisance species. If you think about, they're raising crawfish in their rice fields, things like that. Well, these otters would come in and wipe them out in a short amount of time. So the farmers, the aquaculture facilities, were paying Leroy to come in and capture these otters. And on his property, he had some old chicken houses. If you're familiar with a chicken house, it's a really long barn. And so he put cages in that barn, and then he would turn around and sell those otters to various states for restocking. I want to say it was the late 80s, early 90s. It might have been about 91, I think, that the Great Smoky Mountains National Park, along with the University of Tennessee, decided we're going to try to reintroduce some otters to the Great Smoky Mountains. So I drove with Mary Miller. Her name was Mary Cantrell at the time. It was her graduate project. Drove from Knoxville to Houma, Louisiana, and we picked up a van load of otters. Lesson learned: never drive 12 hours in an enclosed van with 15 otters. But it was an interesting drive. We brought them back. We implanted transmitters in them, and we turned them loose in Abrams Creek in Cades Cove. And they learned a lot about them then. They thought, if it will work in the Smokies, it'll work anywhere in Tennessee. And once the state of Tennessee saw that, they decided, hey, it's working in the Smokies, let's bring them back. And that's where that 487 otters came from. Brought them to Tennessee. And if you think about that, the Wildlife Resources Agency spent $400 plus transportation cost on each otter. So that was quite a bit of money they invested in that back in the early to mid 90s. Now we have otters throughout the state. Prior to that stocking, we only had otters in the far western section along the Tennessee River, or along the Mississippi River. Shirley asked, do they stink? Well, otters don't stink. But when they've been fed ground nutria, which was very interesting as well, nutria are a nuisance species in Louisiana. They're an exotic species. Leroy would drive around picking up roadkill nutria, had a grinder on the property. He would add vitamins to that meat and feed that to the otters. So you can imagine on the way back that, yes, it got quite smelly in the van. You have another slide, Daryl?
So I never.
Yes, I do.
There's Leroy. Now, before you go on any further, has anybody ever seen the anime, or the, I guess, animated show Emmett Otter and a Jug Band Christmas? If you have, that main character looked like a Leroy. That strikes me as funny. Aldo Leopold's father of wildlife management, Leroy Sevan's the father of otter reintroduction.
All right. So what I'm going to do is talk a little bit about that otter reintroduction. I'll let Robert answer any questions we get there, but you have to understand that Robert and I, and any wildlife biologist that has been out there, we've done some really, really cool stuff in our life. Now, I did not have the luxury that Robert had as far as doing otter releases, but throughout the state of Tennessee, I've worked with literally probably a few dozen people that were really involved with those otter releases. And so it pretty much involved going down to Louisiana to pick up more otters to bring back to Tennessee. And so it's got to be a pretty fun thing to release an otter. I've released bears and elk and a whole bunch of other critters, but I unfortunately have never been involved with an otter release. But they have been successful. Yep.
Well, Daryl, there's a series that one of our local TV stations did for years called the Heartland series here in Tennessee, and they did an episode on the otters while we were releasing them. I was actually famous for like half a second in that video. But what it doesn't show in that, of course, it was a big deal when we were releasing otters, so news reports would show up all the time, and they were always warned, stay away from the cages, don't do this, don't do that. One reporter ignored us, and she stuck her finger in the cage. And she learned very quick what it means to be a weasel because the otter had no mercy on her finger whatsoever and their very sharp
I
teeth.
I could verify. I don't know, Robert, if you remembered Ed War, but he was the assistant chief of wildlife for Tennessee for a long time. He was my boss, and one of his biggest wildlife injuries was due to an otter that he got too close to the cage. Okay,
Hmm. They're vicious. They're cute, but they're vicious. And I will add that actually, our our work was in the Smokies, but we did release the first otter in Tennessee, not officially. We were actually putting in implanted transmitters in them so we could follow them with telemetry. And one got out of the squeeze box, crossed Alcoa Highway, and went into the Tennessee River next to UT campus. So actually, I was part of the first release in the state.
that sounds like my unintentional bear release. It happens to the best of us, I guess. So, if you're looking at the results, how well did these state agencies do at restoring otters throughout North America? And we have them close, not all the way, obviously, but we have them close to returning back to their historic distributions. So, throughout almost every nook and cranny east of the Mississippi River, otters have flourished. They've come back wonderfully. We still have a little bit of work to do in the West. We're not doing any more otter releases, but they're just naturally multiplying. We just have to give it a little bit more time. And so the one question. Okay, go ahead.
I'm going to address one of Shirley's. I'm going to address one of Shirley's statements up here real quick. Said that humans don't like them in rivers because they believe they ate all the fish. When we were first bringing them back, especially the park in Abrams Creek, it's a big creek where people go to trout fish, and there were people pushing back because they said they will eat all the trout. And here you have a picture of an otter eating a brown trout. But what we found through subsequent studies was yes, they will eat trout, but suckers are much slower and they prefer slower fish over faster fish. So, yes, they will eat trout, and they will, if they get into your trout hatchery or they get into your pond or what have you, they'll wreak havoc. But in a natural setting, they're eating those fish that people aren't
Funny
fishing
that
for
you
anymore.
mentioned it, Robert, because I belong to a number of outdoor groups on Facebook, and one of the things that the discussion was just a few weeks ago is what are we going to do about all these devastating species? And they listed the wild hog, the otter, and well, obviously wolves are their own separate issue. But as soon as I saw the otter listed, I was like, what's wrong with the otter? And that's exactly what they said. It's like the otter is eating all the game fish, so we got to get rid of the otters. And so there's a convoluted um, thought of what makes a healthy ecosystem out there. So with that, I'm going to end the otter talk here and say, besides the bald eagle, the river otter, true American success story from going to only 25% of their historic range to almost getting that back completely, and how every little nook and cranny east of the Mississippi now has otters back in their waterways. It's just absolutely fantastic. Let me just finish these slides and then we'll answer whatever questions you have. So that was the end of it. We'll sit here and answer whatever questions you have so you can start typing away. Like I said, Bob Howdeshell is just phenomenal with his photographs, and I thank him so much. And y'all, if you could leave a comment on the Wildlife for You Facebook page, that is the best way to communicate. Obviously, we have the Twitter that. Robert, can you hit your mute real quick? Um, we also have the Twitter page that Trish Stevens keeps up. She does a fantastic job there. But if you could go there and leave a comment, the one thing that I will tell everyone is mark your calendars 2 weeks from today. Talked to Kim Delosier a couple of days ago. He's going to help me with the next presentation on Thursday, March 19th, 8 o'clock again. We're going to be talking about Bears of the Smokies, and I'm going to start advertising for this. I think a lot of people will be interested in learning about Bears of the Smokies, but I will forewarn you, This is not going to be one of those shows where we show a picture and say, this is Missy Bear who lives in Abrams Creek, and this is Delilah who's off in here. We're going to be talking more about bear populations of the Smokies, where they come from, what happened to them, how we're taking care of them. We will have fantastic photographs from a lot of amazing photographers of the Smokies, but it's going to be more or less a look at the black bear populations, not just within the park, but in the surrounding area, because they weren't always like you see them now. There are bears coming out of our ears in Great Smoky Mountain National Park. It wasn't always like that. And so it's going to be a really cool talk about the status of bears. And with that, that was that was the last slide, so I'll just leave it here. And if you all have any questions, we'll be happy to answer. Robert, you can answer a couple. I don't know if they're up there, but I'll turn it over to you.
Okay. The first one, let's see, Molly asked, are they apex predators also? Oftentimes, Molly, they are, and especially in smaller systems, yes, they are absolutely apex predators. And Pat asked, do they migrate? One thing we learned in the study in Abrams Creek was it was what we call a hard release. We literally brought them out of the van, set the cages beside the river, and turned them loose. We didn't let them adjust to the area at all. And we found some of them actually crossed the mountain. They left, and they went many miles across land over to different watersheds. So yes, they can cross a lot of land very quickly. And we did it in the wintertime, hoping that they would stay there because it was cold. They'd find a den, but no, some of them just picked up and left. So yes, they can go a long ways. Dana mentioned where in the Smokies best location to spot an otter. Abrams Creek is still the best spot. And there are some places when you're hiking the trail, you have a good view down into the it's really a river, not just a creek, and you can see them. Trish asked, when DDT was widely used, did it impact the otter as well, or perhaps some other wildlife that depend on fish and waterways? Yes and no. DDT is not as hazardous to mammals as it is to birds. There were other pollutants in the stream that have much more of effects. Things like PCBs are estrogen mimics. So you can imagine that endocrine disruptor, it's stopping testosterone production in males. It's decreasing breeding. Will it kill them outright? No, but could it cut down on reproduction? Absolutely. So any of those endocrine disruptors can have indirect effects, and DDT may have had an indirect effect, but it wasn't outright killing the otters.
Folks, if you all don't have any more questions, I want to thank you. You guys were awesome. We're already over an hour, and you had fantastic questions. If anything comes to mind later tonight, tomorrow, whenever, we're always available. Just shoot us an email, and if I can't answer it, Robert will jump on it, but that's what we're here for. We want to make sure when we teach these classes, you get all your questions answered, and that's why we do these webinars. And I do want to thank Robert for joining in tonight. I think you're a big help. I wish we coordinated earlier so I could have let you do a bunch of the slides, but I'm always really late in putting the slides together.
It's okay. I've been busy with about 300 fourth and fifth graders the last 3 days. I didn't have time for anything. Molly, unfortunately, none of my classes are online. I do very field heavy courses, so I don't really have a lot of online content I can put up. Maybe something I might look at as a conservation class in the future, but not right
Robert
now.
and I have been discussing at length about this year's SWAT program, and you guys have always been tremendous supporters. We are going to try to move forward. It will be a little bit smaller this year, but we do still plan on taking students from the Southwest over to the Appalachian Mountains and Great Smoky Mountain National Park and Cherokee National Forest. But you'll hear more about that hopefully within the coming week. All right, with that, I'm going to sign off and thank you.
Thank you, everybody.